A very stimulating topic. We invite you to ask questions and submit your comments also. Our volunteers will be passing around these cards at different periods during the fireside chat. And please do write down whatever questions you might have and also any anecdotes that you might want to share, and we'll pass them up front and address them. Not only is this the season for fireside chats, but also for our annual funded membership campaign here at the center. And in recognition of that, we're going to break from our usual fireside chat tradition of passing the hat, and instead we're going to ask you to consider becoming Cultural Center members. It's very simple. You just use this little form that's sitting at the front and the back entry areas, and your donation will support the continuation of just this sort of historical and arts programming. We're already grateful to major donors who have served as our sponsors today: Olson's Piggly Wiggly, Cream City Coffee, and Kaler Insurance. We're also very pleased to have a very special honorary sponsor, the family and friends of Bob Kasoris, who passed away suddenly on October 30th while in Florida, have announced a $5,000 memorial gift for the preservation and enhancement of the collection at the General Store Museum, and also for other historical efforts conducted by the Cultural Center. Bob's wife, Dee, and two of their daughters are here today. The memorial includes a special donation from daughter Sherry and son-in-law John Stillen of Redmond, Washington. As many of you know, Bob was a docent at the General Store Museum, a great lover of history, a Korean War veteran, and a collector of military memorabilia, some of which is right over here on display today. Our volunteers and staff will miss Bob greatly. He would have loved to have been here today and is surely here in spirit with us. Our thanks and our sympathy go out to his family. And now I'm very pleased and proud to introduce our mayor, who will moderate today's session, Jim Coots, and we'll continue onward. Jim?
Thanks, Sarah. To start our festivities today, we have asked the Peter Wallner Post 288 to begin with posting the colors. So, Dick.
Color guard. Attention. Hut. Advance and post the colors. We will now pledge allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. You may sit.
Just a couple of things before we get started. I think if you watched TV yesterday, you saw that the World War II memorial ceremonies took place in terms of the groundbreaking. My wife and I had an opportunity about 3 years ago to be present in Washington, D.C. for the dedication of the Women in Military Service to America Memorial, and that was a very, very moving and a wonderful occasion. And if you get to Washington, D.C., I would recommend that you visit the Women in Military Service to America Memorial. Also, at Emmanuel Lutheran Church in Cedarburg, for the next couple weeks, they have a display of some of their members who were active in World War II and the Korean War, and they have a very nice display there, which I viewed this morning, so that will be open if any of you would be interested in that. Before we begin today, I would like to just read a short excerpt from a book that many people have quoted from, and have given a name to the people who were involved in World War II, the greatest generation. We hope that next year on Veterans Day we can have another fireside chat, and that one honor the people who were in Korea and Vietnam and some of the more recent conflicts. We thought it was appropriate at this time to do World War II. And I'd like to read just a little bit from Tom Brokaw's introduction to this book. And I quote, "At a time in their lives when their days and nights should have been filled with innocent adventure, love, and the lessons of the workaday world, they were fighting in the most primitive conditions possible across the bloodied landscape of France, Belgium, Italy, Austria, and the Coral Islands in the Pacific. They answered the call to save the world from the two most powerful and ruthless military machines ever assembled, instruments of conquest in the hands of fascist maniacs. They faced great odds and a late start, but they did not protest. They succeeded on every front. They won the war. They saved the world. They came home to joyous and short-lived celebrations and immediately began the task of rebuilding their lives in the world they wanted. They married in record numbers and gave birth to another distinctive generation, the baby boomers. A grateful nation made it possible for more of them to attend college than any society had ever educated anywhere. They gave the world new science, literature, art, industry, and economic strength, unparalleled in the long curve of history. As they now reach the twilight of their adventurous and productive lives, they remain, for the most part, exceptionally modest. They have so many stories to tell. Stories that in many cases they have never told before, because in a deep sense, they didn't think what they were doing was that special, because everyone else was doing it too. And I think it's maybe because of Tom Brokaw's book and some other books that have been published that we are learning a little bit more about what actually transpired during World War II and the people who were involved in it. Let me introduce our panel for today. First of all, Charlie Imbruglia, and Charlie was at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, was in the U.S. Navy. Bob Armbruster, Bob was a B-24 navigator in Europe and flew missions over Europe. Jack Single, Jack was in the Pacific Theater and was involved in the Air Force. Maybe a couple weeks ago you read about Jack in the Milwaukee Journal. His diary was featured, and we're very happy to have Jack with us today. Bob Klug had to wear his uniform and make everybody feel, you know, that Bob doesn't fit. Oh, got to get one of those elastic ones, Bob. Bob Klug was in the Army Air Force, and Bob was stationed in England and then in North Africa and was a radio mechanic and with the Spitfires. Lester Reby. Lester was in a military battalion, the forerunner of what you and I are familiar with as far as MASH, and Lester also served as an interpreter for a while in the area of Germany. Lou Nichols. Lou was a WWII and was stationed in New York and dealt in a number of things, a lot of things in communications, but a number of other things, as she said, and I'm sure there's other people who were here who were in the service, WWIIs or WACs or, you know, different SPARs, and did a lot of things that so freed guys up to be on the fighting front. And then Vivian Lobbs, who's a longtime resident of Cedarburg and is going to share with us some of the things that happened in Cedarburg. And I also ask our eminent, I use that term cautiously, our eminent Cedarburg historian, Ed Rappold, to be with us and maybe share some things about Cedarburg as well. Maybe some of you remember these. This is my personal contribution. This was my job. Those were the flags that hung in my home during the Second World War. I had three brothers who were involved in World War II. The two stars signifying the two, and when they were here, and then the silver star with being across the seas. And then one of my brothers had just finished bombardier school when the war ended and never had an opportunity to go across the seas. And I'm sure many of you here, if you either participated in one of the conflicts, you all have some memories and some stories, and we hope as we progress today that the audience can be involved. We'll have the cards going around in terms of asking questions, and if you'd like to comment personally, please feel free to do that. Okay? We've asked the panelists to have us share, or have them share with us some of the things that they remember, some special events, and I think it would be appropriate for us to start with Charlie, seeing he was at Pearl Harbor on that day of infamy, December 7th, 1941. I think we've heard that many times from President Roosevelt, and we thought it would be appropriate that President Roosevelt would be our picture in front of us today. That picture happened to hang over my uncle's bed from the day that President Franklin Roosevelt became president until he died, and I kind of treasure that. So, Charlie, you want to get us started?
Okay, you notice I got some notes here because my memory's so good these days. I got to have something to remind me what I'm supposed to be talking about. Well, let me give you a little background on how I got to Pearl Harbor. I'd been in the Navy for a couple of years, and during the height of the Depression, and I was lucky enough to make coxswain. For you land lovers, that's third-class boatswain's mate. And I was a pretty small guy in stature compared to the rest of them, so being a third-class boatswain's mate has to be a pretty tough job sometimes. So instead of putting me in charge of a bunch of tough sailors, they put me in charge of the captain's gig. That's the captain's personal motor launch. And of course, being in charge of that was the same thing as being his personal taxi cab driver. So evenings, of course, the captain and a couple of officers, or 3, 4 officers, they would go to the officers' club nights for enjoyment, entertainment, what have you, and of course I'd have to drive them over there. And those guys, they would never come out till 4 or 5 o'clock, maybe 7 o'clock in the morning, and we'd have to wait for them. Well, one night we got tired of waiting, so he says, told my mate, I says, let's go ashore and grab a couple of beers. So that's what we did. We went ashore and went over to one of the nightclubs close by over there, and we hooked up with a couple of broads. And so I says, well, I talked them into taking a ride on this new captain's gig that I had. It was a brand new Higgins bottom boat. That thing really had guts. You push that throttle and that nose would go up in the air and away she'd go. So I was going to take them out and show off a little bit. And once I spotted a bunch of logs in the water over there. I said, gee, I'll cruise up against the end and I'll give it the gun, and boy, those things will, I thought there was a bunch of mud hens is what I thought they were. I thought they'll fly all over the place. Well, I kind of cruised up there and I gave it the gun, you know, and then all of them went clonk, clonk. There was a bunch of logs. And one of them got stuck in the propeller, and so there we sat dead in the water. Now what am I going to do? Well, we signaled, and I think it was the WASP aircraft carrier was in port, and they sent somebody over to motor launch, and they hauled us in. And of course, the captain had a long wait. We weren't there to pick him up. So he was real happy about that. So after colors and setting up exercise aboard ship, they had mast. For you land lovers, that's caught on deck. He didn't waste any time. And here I had just made coxswain, and I was so proud of that, and off come the rating down to second-class seaman. I said, well, now what am I going to do? Well, we were at the destroyer base in San Diego, and I could hear the band playing every day, and they'd be marching around, and I found out there was a music school there. Well, I played in several bands before I got in the service. I said, I got to go over and see if I can get in. So I got in, I went over, took exam, got into the music school, and 3 months later, I found myself in Pearl Harbor. That's how I got down to Pearl Harbor. Well, while we're down there, we had, well, half of the fleet would be out on maneuvers, and half of the fleet would be in for liberty and recreation. And it was really a good time, real good liberty part over there. On Saturday night, that's the 6th of December, all the ships that were out at sea were called in. And the harbor was jammed because there really wasn't that much room, so they moored next to one another. They tied on, the Oklahoma was tied on next to us over there. Following morning, we were up early, and well, always did get up early. We played for, the band always played for setting up exercises and then for colors. And I was anxiously getting up there because the Oklahoma that was tied next to us, I had 3 buddies on there that I'd been in music school with and been on Liberty with, and I wanted to see them guys. So I was looking at it, oh, once we see all these planes, hundreds of them, what gives here? You know, these guys don't maneuver on a Sunday morning as a rule, and the reason we didn't recognize them right away because our planes have that red circle with the blue stars on it, and then up in the blue sky you don't see that blue, you just see that red circle. That's why we thought it was our planes. Well, just like they just about covered the harbor, it seemed like they went off at a signal. Of course, the first bombs that fell were at Hickam Field, which was a stone's throw, like from here to that door, away from where we were. And of course, we all started to run for general quarters sounded, and we started running our battle stations. And about the time a bomb exploded right on the Oklahoma there, and I'll never forget that scene. That hit right where the band was, and I could still see those instruments up in the air there. Some of those fellows from the band were saved because later on they joined us, but my 3 buddies never made it. So we were there, well, it took us about a week to pick up the debris, bodies or what have you. Our ship received about 3 bombs. We were less damaged than most ships there. The Oklahoma next to us gotten several torpedoes, I don't know how many, and she capsized, and being tied to us, she was pulling us over, and of course she got those big 3-inch lines, and we had quite a job finding access to, I say we, I mean the men aboard ship, finding access to cut those so that would free us, and that took quite a while there. But as I says, it took us maybe a week to clean that mess up over there. And in the meantime, why, in between we had a recreational base close by there that you wasn't working all the time, so we just went ashore, walked off the ship, went ashore and played cards and had a few beers and spend the time that way. Because as long as you was aboard ship, whether you was on duty or not, you had to work. So every chance we got, we had enough of it. We went over and relaxed a little bit. So one day I was off the ship at the time, and all at once the sirens going and the horns about the ships blowing all over. They're going to take off. So we all ran for the ship, and sure enough, it was a surprise. Nobody knew. It was a secret that the fleet was going to take off, and we were going to go to Bremerton Navy yards for repairs. We all had minor repairs there. We had quite a bit of welding to be done in the forward part of the ship, the forecastle, which was kind of a bad situation when we got that bomb, because that thing penetrated 3 decks, and that's where our sick bay, which is the hospital, was, and we had to put up makeshift quarters, and there was a lot of men that sure needed the help, not necessarily from our ship, from all over, because there was a lot of ships that were sunk and they had no sick bays to go to. The hospitals and the bases were all filled up. Well, anyway, some of that welding wasn't that hot. We were at sea coming back, and some of that started to leak, and of course the leak wasn't that bad that our pumps couldn't take care of it, but we had the Christmas at sea. I still have that menu. We never had a menu before, but it's a beautiful card, like a Christmas card, and it's printed on there, and realized we ate so good in the Navy. But we did that that Christmas anyway. Well, we pulled into, it was slow going, we pulled in Bremerton the night on New Year's Eve. And so just about everybody got liberty, of course. And I went ashore and probably had 2 many because in the morning I woke up with a receipt that I had rented a room in a hotel for a whole month. What in the world am I going to do? I'm going to really be broke, you know? What am I going to do for money now when I go ashore? Well, I got an idea. I started renting that room out. Only problem is I rented it to too many guys sometimes for the same night, and when 2 couples went in at the same time, I was in trouble, believe me. So after we got, let me see, what am I talking about here? Boy, I got way, way off the subject.
Charlie, maybe we can move on and then we'll come back to your spot later. Okay. Bob? Thanks, Charlie. Thank you. Bob?
After Charlie, that's a hard act to follow.
That's maybe why he's a chaplain now at the Legion, huh?
Pardon me, I forgot one thing. Okay. The most important thing. When those bombs started falling down, I says, Lord, you get me out of this, I'm yours. And praise the Lord, while we were getting temporary repairs over there at 1500 hours, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the loudspeaker says there will be Bible classes. And I attended that Bible class, and in them days, the navigators, they call themselves the navigators, quite a big organization today. They were in their infancy, and that's where I really and truly got to meet the Lord, and boy, that was the best day of my life.
Thanks, Charlie. Okay, Bob.
Well, I was went into service in 1943 in Port Washington. There was a courthouse, and our whole group left to report into Milwaukee. We went into the interurban station. At that time, there was the interurban between Port Washington and Milwaukee, and we had a fellow with us, a fellow by the name of Jim Buck, who was quite a humorist and liked to pull a lot of tricks. And on this interurban, they had an emergency cord. Her dad wouldn't like that. Her dad was a motorman.
Bob, can you hold the mic up just a little? Her dad was a motorman on the interurban, and wouldn't have liked that, anybody pulling the emergency cord, but Jim figured, oh, what the heck, there's nothing to lose, and he did this on the way in. But we were eventually went into the Air Force together, and we had training in Florida, at the University of Alabama, advanced navigation, all through all the schooling, and usually in service you're separated. Each time you move another, they take every 3rd person or every 5th place person and put them at a different base, but I was the last of the A's, ARM, and he was the first of the B's, BACH, and so we always stayed together. We, at the University of Alabama, we had desks next together. We'd be at a air base. He'd have the upper bunk, I'd have the lower bunk, and so we stayed together until we got our commissions. We flew 18 training flights together, so we had a lot of happy memories there. There was a great demand for navigators and for aircrew members, and so we were always in rushed courses. There was never any time for, not much time for leaves or things, but I eventually joined a crew and was assigned to a B-24 training base out in Idaho, and we trained together as a crew. And when we finished our training,
went to Topeka, Kansas, and picked up a new plane that had just been manufactured at the Willow Run plant, and we flew it over to England. We had a lot of trouble with this plane. We had a fire on the plane between Gander, Newfoundland. No, it was let's see, Gander, Newfoundland, and Greenland, and so we had to make an emergency landing over in England, and we also hit a violent snowstorm when we landed in Iceland, and we were held up there for a couple of weeks. But eventually I got over to the England and was assigned to a B-24 base about 90 miles north of London. And from there we flew our missions over Germany and France. One of the things that I was over there for VE Day, and one of the things I remember there too, they were going to let the British celebrate by themselves. They had been under blackout for 6 years, so they let the British celebrate themselves. There were blackouts, and they had bonfires. But the thing I remembered after that, the head of our base, a colonel, was going to put us right to work preparing for Japan, and he had on the bulletin board, he had a list of physical training, all the things that we were studying, maps of Japan, but one of the persons didn't like it and took a match to these orders and burned it up, and this infuriated the colonel, and we were expected to go into town the next day to celebrate with the British, but he made us, all the officers at the base, march for 3 nights, from colonels, majors, second lieutenants like myself. We marched for 3 nights on a ramp in front of the club. But that was another, the fellows didn't appreciate that too much, but nobody would give the name of the fellow that did this, so we suffered for that.
Okay, thanks, Bob. Jack? Yeah. I know in the article that was in the journal and with your diary, and you said that you were in the Pacific Theater. Did you spend your whole time in the Pacific Theater in the Air Force, or were you, yeah, I'm sure you had your training here and then you went over there.
That was enough, Jim.
Yeah.
Well, I started in the States at Boca Raton, Florida in radar school. And we flew a few missions down there when if you recall, the Germans had some submarines off the Florida coast, and that was our training, and we practiced on them. But then I went to Tyndall Field in Florida also for aerial gunnery school, and then up to Sioux Falls, South Dakota. And I have a memory of that yet because I had a few pops like Charlie too many one night, and coming back, when you came in the gate, you probably were sleeping or conked out, one of the two, I don't know which, but you counted the stops the bus made. And that night I counted the stops and got off at my stop and counted the barracks and went down and took my clothes off and jumped in the upper bunk, and the guy said, "What the hell are you doing in here?" I was on the wrong side of the base. The bus driver came in a different way that night. But why I remember today is it was 23 below zero, and I had to walk, I don't know how far, but I'd say 2 miles. And I still, today, can't stay out in the air, freezing air longer than 4 or 5 minutes without freezing my ears. Then I went to, we were supposed to be the first B-29 on Saipan, and we lost an engine on takeoff out at Sacramento Air Base and had to go back, and that took 3-4 days. And then the second time out, the pilot somehow hit a guy wire and tore the tip off one of our wings. That took another week. So we ended up third plane over there to land on Saipan while they were still fighting for the island. And we ended up completing 38 missions, which was the most in the 20th Bomber Command. And I get broken up here a little. Out of 20 crews, we were one of only 2 to come home. We lost 18 original crews, plus 6 others that filled in later on. And you asked our most memorable day would be the day I completed the 38th and knew I was possibly going home. And my buddy's crew, who was the other one that completed 2 out of 20, completed his the next day. And we had a celebration that night, naturally. Now, we thought we were going to come home, naturally, after that, and go home on a furlough, like you usually do when you're overseas somewhere. Instead, they sent us to Lake Muroc, California, which today is Edwards Air Force Base, to study, to be trainers for the other navigators, because I was a staff sergeant and a radar navigator, and the new men coming in were all commissioned, like Bob here, and they were going to commission us now after 3 years of being an enlisted man. That don't sit too good with you. You don't. It'd probably mean more money for 1 month. But we also thought that the officers would probably need more points to get out of the service, that's how you get out, on the amount of points you had, based on several different things. But anyway, the fellows that went there, we all flunked out on purpose. Yeah, and we got a 3-day pass into LA, and I brought a picture. I had a picture of Doris Day singing up in the bandstand with the band. Who was the band in those days that she was with? I got it, but I can't come up with it. Les Brown and the Band of Renown. And she had all the freckles, you see, because we were right up watching. And so then we flunked out, and then we got to go home on a 2-week furlough. 2 humorous things that Charlie mentioned, some humorous things. There wasn't too much humor over there, quite frankly. But one time the EWO, the Japs sent down Betty bombers at night to keep us awake, and fighters, and they'd strafe our barracks, and they knew right where the airmen were, and they'd strafe our barracks. And it was very warm over there, and you slept without clothes on most of the time. And I can remember, it's sort of dumb now, grabbing the pit helmet and trying to hold that over my whole body, as if that was going to do any good. The other one, I always admired entertainers that could entertain people, and but the closest I came to that was the night our last mission, it was at 30,000 feet, which was unusual because most of our air fire raids, they call them, were down at 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 feet, although the B-29 was built to go at 30,000 and be pressurized, but it didn't work out. And just for a second, the reason it didn't work out is when we'd be flying 225 into a target on the run, I'd have to call out the miles to the target on the radar, and it'd be 20, and then call the 15, and I wouldn't call 15. The pilot would say radar, and I'd say 20. And he'd say radar, I'd say 20. Well, we were flying right into the jet stream, which we know about today. In fact, the pilot wrote an article in Reader's Digest the night we stood still over Tokyo Bay. So then what you got to do is turn the plane around and go the other way. Now you know how fast you're going, don't you? You're going twice as fast. And the bombardier don't have much time to grind up anything into that bomb site. But anyway, on this weather mission, we were at around 30,000 feet. And in the radar room, I never got to see anything because that's a room, and I see the gunners on the side, but I didn't get to see much going on outside. I had a little trap door, and you opened that door because they had a lot of ACAC. They didn't have much of night fighters, but they had a lot of ACAC. And I had to drop the foil out of that little door to throw their ground radar off. And all their searchlights caught that little door and lit out that little radar room like I was on Broadway. I felt like I got to get up and do a soft shoe. So that's about the size of it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack. Bob, I know you were in England, and then you went to North Africa, and you said near the end of the war you were kind of ready to go to the Pacific. You never got over there, or did you get over there too?
No, I don't know. Is this mic working? Yeah. I was disqualified for further overseas duty. When I came back, I wound up in the hospital with malaria. And of course, that didn't keep me there, but I also had picked up some kind of an infection on my foot. Well, in fact, it spread over parts of my body, and that kept me in the hospital for over 6 months. And that disqualified me for further overseas duty, thank goodness. Then I spent the last few months out on the West Coast until the war ended. But the odd part of it was they never did find out what I had. I used to know what it resembled. On my discharge from the hospital, they put down resembles something like lichen planus hypertrophica or something. I used to know it. But They just didn't know what it was. And so one good thing that came out of it, I didn't have to wear the regular GI shoes anymore. They issued me Oxfords because of this thing I had on my foot. Other than that. But to put things in perspective, some of you remember the war broke out in Europe on September 1st of '39. And about a year later, the draft started here in the United States. That was September, October of 1940. And my number came up in the draft in June of 41. The draft doctor said he couldn't find anything wrong with me, so I went right to the draft board and said, well, the doctor says I'm okay, when do I leave? This was like about the third week in June, and they said, you go with the July 30th quota. I said, thank you. And I'd had enough camping out and marching in the Boy Scouts, so I didn't want to get drafted into the infantry. I'm not a hero. I went to see about enlisting. Well, they were only taking enlistments for the Air Force that summer, and that suited me because I'd been crazy about airplanes since I was a kid. So I got things in order with my job and finished work on June 30th. July 8th I enlisted and wound up over at Selfridge Field. I became a radio man. I wanted to go to radio school. I knew you had to do that, and they weren't sending anybody to school. They were trying to get guys out of school because this was a new outfit. It was just created. In fact, there were several new outfits that were created at Selfridge that summer. So it worked out, I thought, to my advantage afterward, because the guys who really knew radio, they had to work in on the bench to repair any radios that had to be fixed. So I worked out on the flight line. I checked the radios before the pilots left on a mission, and I checked them when they came back, if they came back, which they didn't always do. And that was one of the hard parts about the service, because you got to know these guys, you got to like them. But we were in the States a year until July of '42. We shipped out to England and immediately went over to Northern Ireland. We were stationed near Londonderry. And lo and behold, we had P-39 Bel Air Cobras here in the States. We got over there and we wound up with Spitfires, a British fighter. And we thought, you know, it didn't look as good to us as the 39 did, but we soon developed a healthy respect for the Spitfire, because in North Africa afterwards, our Spitfires escorted P-39s on tank busting missions. The 39 had speed and firepower. It didn't have the altitude or maneuverability that the Spitfire had. We were at Londonderry for, I don't know, a month or so, moved down to England, and we were near London for only 2 weeks. We would have liked to stay there for the duration. We didn't know how long this war was going to last, but we liked London and we liked being there. There were girls there too, and that helped. But anyway, we moved up northern England, and then we shipped out November 1st for North Africa. We got into Iran the day after the fighting had stopped in that area. We marched 16 miles out to the aerodrome, and we weren't in shape. Guys were dropping out like flies. They drifted in the next day, you know. Pardon? No, it wasn't hot at that, not in November. That came later. But anyway, that was where we got our indoctrination into the beginning of the war. We didn't get any enemy activity there, but we worked our way across North Africa, and after the African campaign ended, we went over to Sicily and then up to Corsica, spent 6 months there, and were re-equipped there. They took the Spitz away and gave us the P-51. And after that, our pilots did long-range escort work, and we moved over to Italy, and then in September of '44, a bunch of us were brought back. They were getting a lot of B-29s into production, and they wanted cadres to build up units around those planes, and a bunch of us, a boatload, were brought back from Italy, from the Mediterranean. we got home here in September of '44. And of course, it was really great to get back here while the war was still going on and see what was happening. And we didn't like everything that we heard, like people bragging about how they were getting around, getting out of all this ration stuff. They knew people. That didn't set too well with us where we were fighting the war. But then we reported out to Lincoln, Nebraska for reassignment, and that's where the malaria caught up with me because I had quit taking the Atabrine. In fact, on the ship coming back, the doctor said, he was looking at this sore on my foot, which had started just before I left Italy. And he said, "You still taking your Atabrine? It makes you yellow, you know." And I said, "Yeah." Well, he said, "You're out of the danger zone now, so you're all right." But of course, I had already been bitten by a malaria mosquito, apparently, and all the Atabrine did was stave off the attack. Once you quit, you're off the Atabrine. Well, it took a month, and I came down with it out there at Lincoln, and that's where I spent 6.5 months in the hospital, and then wound up on the West Coast for the duration.
Thanks, Bob.
Tell them a story about giving the virus to the British soldiers.
Well, that'll come later. We're kind of moving around.
Yeah, we'll
here.
go around and then we'll come back. Yeah. Okay. Lester, people maybe have been wondering why this is hanging here. Let me show them what it is, okay? And I'll also take my questions that I forgot before. Now, Les, you were in Germany.
Right.
And I wondered what this was when Les brought it in, but let me just extend it and then I'll show you. The lantern that he was able to pick up and bring back from there. And there's a lot of souvenirs over on the tables over there. You know, if you haven't looked at them before, then you can look at them later. So, Les, if you want to proceed.
Okay. I went into service same time Bob did. Same place, Port Washington, and we ended up at Camp Grant. And then we ended up in California, Fort Ord, and was there for 11 months. And then we went on maneuvers, and we had a company of mules attached to our unit. And they were pack mules. They were training for the invasion of Sicily and Italy. Well, and from there, I'll skip a lot of it. Then we left to Boston for Europe. We had a ship that had 16,000 troops on board, 6,000 Marines, 3,000 Marines, and 3,000 sailors. And it took us 7 days to get from Boston to Liverpool.
Probably 16,000 on one ship?
On one ship.
6,000, Charlie.
There are 22,000 on total on board.
Still was packed like sardines.
Well, we were on. Some of them went by rail, too. Well, anyway, when we arrived in Liverpool, it was at midnight. We boarded a British train for Southampton, and we arrived there at noon. And then we boarded the English tramp steamer that was on for crossing the channel. But the storm came up, and we had to stay on board ship. But the thing was, the ones that ended up as on KP, they got the best meals. The rest of them just got beans. And, well, we were in the channel for 2 days, and then we landed on Utah Beach, and then we were bivouacked on a field that had hedgerows. And the hedgerows could have been mined in booby-trapped then yet. And then they had fields where they had poles in so that when gliders came in, they would be ripped apart. Well, from there, we were in France for 2 months. Oh, by the way, our meals were real good. Spam. And that was 3 meals a day. And sometimes we got some corned beef, but that didn't happen very often. And then as a supplement, they gave us a chocolate bar once a week. Well, as we moved into Belgium, then the buzz bombs started coming over. And they were the V1s and the V2s, and they were the big forerunners of our jet engines. And then these bombs, the V1s, they would fly, and as soon as the flames went out, then they ran out of fuel and they dropped down. But then they had the V2 rockets, and they would fly and then they'd drop down and fly and drop down. And after, at the third stop, then you had to blow the whistle. So we were bivouacked in a gymnasium, and from there there was an apple orchard right next to it, but we had to dig our foxholes in there because we had no other place to go for protection. But it rained, and the foxholes were all filled with water. So they weren't really no good for anything. Well, then we went from Belgium into Holland, and from Holland into Germany, and this was on December 7th, and that I won't forget either, of 44. And, well, what happened then? Well, anyway, then we were there for till Christmas, and then we had to move back because the Battle of the Bulge was going on, and well, the Germans were dropping MPs dressed in American uniforms and directing traffic the wrong way, and that lasted for a day, and the road that they were directed on was mined on both sides of the road. The shoulders were mined, and we were walking guard duty, 2 men to a post during that period of time. Well, then we moved back into Holland and to regroup, and then from there we went into Germany once more and waited at the Rhine until the bridge at Remagen fell, and then from there we went to the Ruhr Pocket. Bob, you should remember that, don't you? The Ruhr Pocket, where the Dortmund, Essen, and Dusseldorf. Well, the armies, the 7th Army and the 9th Army, they just surrounded them and bypassed them and kept on following Patton. Well, anyway, then we waited there until they surrendered, and then we had to go in and, well, our duty was to take care of the hospitals, whether they were German, whether they had civilians and all that. We had to separate them according to nationality and so forth. Well, there I ended up with capturing several German officers who were hiding in the hospital. And I was working through group headquarters at the time. And the one officer, he says, I haven't gotten a weapon. He says, all I've got is a holster with a block of wood in it. And he said, that's what some of the newer officers got, that there were no weapons to go around anymore. And, oh, and then before that, our CO was supposed to take me along to another town and check on a hospital there. Well, there was no hospital in that town, and it's quiet. I've never been to a place where it was that quiet. Nothing stirred, no sound whatsoever. And in a few moments, we were surrounded by German civilians. They came out of the air raid shelters, and they wanted to know if it was safe for them to come out. Well, it was safe as far as we were concerned. So then we asked him where the next hospital was. He said, oh, about 15 minutes. Well, 15 minutes could be, was it walking, driving, or whatever, but they wouldn't tell us that. And well, then the lieutenant says, I think we better check in on that because our orders were to do that. Well, we got to this town, and the MP said, you can't go any further. There's snipers around. And the lieutenant said, well, we have to check in on this hospital. And we did, but he says, we're going to walk. You and I, the officer, he and I, and the Jeep driver followed us until we, several blocks till we got to this hospital. And there we found several GIs that had been injured, and they said they were taken care of real well.
Okay, thanks, Les. Okay, is that... I don't want to cut you off if you have some more to... Lou? Lou has a letter that when she was on, I think, Lou, you said when you were on duty, you, that was a letter that came through?
Yes. One of my jobs was intercepting the mail as it came to the office. There were no computers at that time, of course, and everything was via personnel. And I, in turn, had to take the communiques to the officers, and sometimes I kept a copy, which probably was a no-no. But this was a release from James Forrestal, who was the Secretary of the Navy at that time, and it's dated the 12th of April, 1945. I have the sad duty of announcing to the Naval Service the death of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States, which occurred on 12 April. The world has lost a champion of democracy who can ill be spared by our country and the Allied cause. The Navy, which he so dearly loved, can pay no better tribute to his memory than to carry on in the tradition of which he was so proud. Colors shall be displayed at half-mast for 30 days, beginning 0800, 13 April, west longitude, date insofar as war operations permit. Memorial services shall be held on the day of the funeral, to be announced later at all yards and stations and on board all vessels of the Navy, war operations permitting. Wearing of mourning badges and firing of salutes will be dispensed within view of war conditions. The end.
Now, was that, Lou, what kind of activities were you involved in terms of many secretarial type of things, or were there other types of activities that you were involved in?
I was receptionist for the office. We had an office of about 100 personnel, which included some civilians, but mostly Navy personnel. Prior to my going in service, I was working in Iowa at an ordnance plant where they manufactured munitions. And I was hired as a government licensed chauffeur, which meant because cars weren't issued like they are today or weren't available like they are today. And on base, the ordnance base, we had enlisted personnel, military personnel, as well as civilians. And these persons had to go to different areas of the base for inspection and whatever else. So because cars weren't available to all of them, we worked out of what we call the sedan pool, and they would call into this pool for transportation to attend to whatever duty they had to do. Well, because I was government licensed, and when I went in the Navy, apparently this information went in my jacket, and that in turn led to my working with a paymaster from our office, which meant counting a lot of money, and taking him out to the taking him out to the pay lines for the enlisted personnel to come and get paid. So that was another job I had.
Now I know why they have you collect the money at fish fries at Legion on Friday night.
Thank you. And another job that I had was, well, there was mail came in that was exclusively for the officers. And sometimes things came in regarding the Navy personnel that was strictly taboo. I remember walking into the officer in charge of our office one day with a mailing that had come in, and it was not for publication, and he just looked up at me and he said, "You never saw this," which meant your lips are sealed, that type of thing. And I don't know, there were so many various things.
But you generally did a lot of things so that there could be some of the guys freed to go off and fight, or to be involved in more wartime activities.
That's correct. I also had to work on regular, everyday forms and things that, for instance, when a draft of recruits were leaving the base, we had to accumulate all of their records. Everything had to be brought up to date. And there were many days when we worked from 7 in the morning and we did not finish until 11 at night. If a big draft had to leave the base, all the records had to be up to date and ready to go with them in the draft. So,
one of the things that's so great about the Women's in-service to America Memorial in Washington, D.C. is that it shows all the different activities that the women were involved in. The women who flew planes, you know, from one base to another, so that other people could be flying in whatever they were involved in terms of the wartime activities. And there's so many different things that were involved, that women were involved in during the war. I know we have Mrs. Van Dinner, who served in World War II. Mrs. Nusswanger is here, I think, who was also in the Second World War, and I'm sure there may be some others. A lot of different activities that the women were involved in. So if you go to Washington, D.C., my wife said I had to give the plug for the Women in Military Service to Memorial, because she's been very active in that, and it's really a great thing that you can see the role that women played. I think that we sometimes think that they, you know, I wasn't trying to pull Lou on as far as the secretarial type of stuff, but that was one thing that was done, but there were a lot of other activities that were done during the war. Vivian, you and I were on the home front, so you want to tell us a little bit about Cedarburg during the war? I wasn't in Cedarburg, but I was just a little shrimp, but I remember a lot about it.
Well, so far I've been a lifelong member of Cedarburg. And one of the things I remember was during rationing, and I used to do a little shopping. My dad made a grocery cart out of an old orange crate and made wheels on and a little handle, and I'd go to my grandma and my aunts and cousins, and I'd do all the shopping, whatever they wanted. Well, when it was rationed, they'd give me a few little coupons or a token and try to get sugar, and bananas were hard to get, so I tried to stagger them and get some for my grandmother one day and maybe for an aunt. They all lived on Hamilton Road. We kind of took care of one whole block there. And then my husband was telling me when he was through with the farm work, he had time to work and the canneries needed help, so he worked at the canneries, and he had to drive a bus to take the prisoners from the Cedarburg cannery to Thiensville where they were fed. It was kind of interesting to find that out. He said they had no problems. They were just so glad to have a job and to be fed. And well, my sister worked at the pants factory in Cedarburg on Hilbert Street, it was at that time, where they made all pants for the servicemen. And I don't know if I should repeat this, but she did put her name and address in a pocket, and she did get to hear from somebody. And when he came, it kind of was a surprise. You know, she told the family, and we thought, oh boy, now we wondered who was going to be coming, but he did look her up, so. And well, when peace was declared, we were just little Schaefers, and my mother took my twin brother and I walked downtown, and I can remember it was about by the Rivoli and by Vic's barber shop. There was a parade, and everybody, well, not everyone, but a lot of people threw toilet tissue in the trees and in the poles, and I don't know, maybe you remember Bill Williams, a big, tall strapper, and I can remember he was the leader of the parade, strutting his, and he was a big, tall fella. And I don't think we stayed that long. My dad was probably working at the time, but just my mother and my twin brother and I went. But
well, you mentioned yesterday that near where the gym is now, or City Hall. Now, Eddie, you probably know that, or Bob, that was where the local honor roll was in that area.
In fact, I have a picture of it right here.
Oh, okay.
I do too.
But if you ever want to picture anything from any time in Cedarburg, see either Ed or Bob, and they'll have it. Yeah.
The honor rolls for the city and town of Cedarburg. I counted the rows. There were.
Bob, would you use the mic, please? Use the mic. Mike.
Use your mic.
There were 205 names on this list. I noticed mine wasn't on there. But there's a town in Cedarburg honor list, and they kept adding names on there.
And that was right where the gym is now, in that area, in front of City Hall?
Next to the Cedarburg Insurance Building, next to, it's now the Gustav Building.
Oh, okay, okay, right down here on Washington. Oh, okay, okay.
But my postcard shows a lot more. You must have a real older one, and my postcard is newer. I have it on the table on the display too, and it's got a few more columns of names, and the Regnuts boys are on, John and Hugo and
Louis.
You need, I'm not sure if I spy, but you need a magnifying glass to kind of read the names.
Okay. Ed, you want to explain your picture that you have something that happened in Cedarburg during the war?
Well, these are just a couple little tidbits I picked up. Some of the ladies did their homework, and if you ever walked past the Kifu's house, years ago it had a one big picture window instead of the way it was put back in earlier days as we see it today. But as you walked by there at night, you could see Johanna, Marie, and Hattie sitting around the table spinning or knitting away for fare. They made mittens and caps and scarves and everything for the soldiers. I remember I got a nice olive green sweater from one of the churches, and I don't know if I ever wore it because I went to Florida. But Gus Reeder had a woodworking plant across Hanover from where the schools are, and he had first made in-wall disappearing ironing boards. But when the war came along, then he switched over to making cases and boxes for speakers. So he was in the war effort also. Then how many people knew there was an eggplant in Cedarburg? Okay, it's not the kind you eat. This one is on the on Western Avenue, about where the ambulance shed and where the water tower is now. It was a 3-story big brick building, which formerly was a dairy. But when the war came along, then they had a whole bunch of women cracking eggs and drying them for the servicemen. Now, I'm sure some of you fellows had dried eggs, and they came from Cedarburg. What else was there? Oh, the Keycafer at that time was making engines for motors and for small appliances, but when the war came along, then he went up with the distant people, created a chainsaw, and they were generally a 2-man chainsaw. One held the heavy end on the motor end, and the other one took the steering end. But they were generally around 5-6 feet long, and they took care of a lot of the lumber that was needed for the service.
Thanks, Ed. One thing that we didn't touch on, I don't think this is a fragile question for any of you anymore, but one of the things that always impresses me is how young the people were that served in World War II. When you went in service, Charlie, how old were you?
17, you're right about my age.
How many people did that? How many, you know, when you talk about that word patriotism, to me, you think in terms, I always think in terms of World War II and how many guys did just what you did because they felt it was their duty to their country to serve their country. My youngest brother graduated from high school in 1943, and I was 7 years old, and I can remember every day he ran down to the post office to see if his orders came because he had enlisted in the Air Force. And he ran, literally ran every day because he couldn't wait for his orders, and I can still see him coming back that day when his orders finally came, and I was happy because then I got his bicycle, so that was had something to do for me too. Bob, how about you? Charlie, go ahead.
We had a big Texas kid aboard ship. He cried like a baby when stuff happened. He was 13 years. He was 13 years old. Really? From Texas, right? Yeah. Oh. Yeah.
Bob.
Well, I was the oldest one on our crew. We have a crew of 10 in service. The gunners were all 18 and 19. My pilot was 22. Well, he had listed at 18. he retired with 30 years of service at 52. So he had, we had a real young crew. The Air Force didn't take in anybody under over 26, so they were all young people on the cruise.
Jack, how about you?
Yeah, I was working night shift the day that Pearl Harbor was attacked. I was 17, and we went down en masse the next morning to volunteer. However, I was only 17, so I couldn't get my parents' permission, so I had to wait till December 14th, a year later, and then I got out when I was 21.
Bob?
Well, I'm the old geezer in the crowd. I was 27 when I went in, and that was one of the things that kept me from flying. I would have just loved to have been a pilot, but I had 3 strikes against me. One was my age, and 26 and a half really was the limit, and I was 27. And I wore glasses, and in 41 yet, before Pearl Harbor, you still needed 2 years of college to go into flight training, and they did away with that after Pearl Harbor.
Lester?
I was 18. We graduated on Friday night, and the next Wednesday we were in. We didn't have much choice.
Lou, how about you? Oh, you're not going to say. Okay, okay. Okay. Never ask a woman her age. I'm sorry. That's sorry. You know, one thing, Jack, that you mentioned before was seeing Doris Day. How about USO entertainment? Did any of you did you see some USO entertainment during the course of the war?
You bet. Well, some of you may have read the book Four Jills and a Jeep, and we had them when we were in North Africa. I know there was Martha Ray, Mitzi Mayfair. I'm having a senior moment. I think Carol Landis, but there were 4 of them, but Martha Ray and Mitzi Mayfair were 2 of them.
Carol Landis.
Carol Landis, and who the 4th one was, I don't remember now. But yeah, we had Bob Hope in North Africa. Gee, but we had a fair number of. Well, I got to tell you about one of them. This wasn't a well-known star. We were in Corsica, and I had a GI license, although as a radio man I could drive, and I had to drive some of these entertainers, pick them up and bring them in, and they had backed a crash trailer, one of these big trailers on which they put a cracked up airplane and haul them away. They'd backed that into a tent there, and then they had some boxes that you'd step on to get up onto this platform, and they were going to put on an act, and this one gal that I had driven said she wanted me to be in this thing, so I said, all right. And what happened, a guy would get up on the stage, and then they'd do some kind of a jitterbug with him or whatever. And well, one of them was a Bumps of Daisy. The one ahead of us was a Bumps of Daisy. And so I said to this gal, well, I can't do that. I had all tools in my pockets, you know. And I said, I better take them out. No, she says, wait, that'll be good for a laugh. So, well, she gets up there, and I get up there, and we're going to do the Bumps of Daisy, and I say, wait a minute, and I empty my pockets, you know, and of course that's always good for a laugh. And then at the end, she put her hand on my tummy and one hand behind my head and made me do a bow. Now she says, you do the same thing to me. And then when I did, she said, now rub my tummy. So here, you know, I mean, she was wearing a 2-piece dance set, and I was rubbing a bare tummy. And of course, that kind of brought down the house. And that night, that was a Wednesday, and our squadron was by itself at that time. The rest of the group was over the other side of the island, and Wednesday nights is when the chaplain came to our squadron, and he had been there that day, and he saw this show. When I walked into chapel that night, and boy, he really looked at me, you know, and didn't say anything, but his look said a lot.
Anybody else as far as...
Kay Francis. Jack came to the rescue. That was Kay Francis.
Okay. Anybody else as far as any... Yeah, Lou?
I learned to know Patrick Hitler, who was a nephew of Adolf Hitler. He was stationed on the base, and he was in a couple of the musicals we did. Nice guy.
I would imagine that, you know, difficult for him in some cases, I would imagine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Bob?
I saw some of the people I can't remember when I was at a base at Mountain Home, Idaho. But then in England, I saw Jimmy Stewart a number of times, and at that time he was in uniform and a colonel, and you didn't, second lieutenant didn't butt in or talk to the colonel, and he did a great job over there. He conducted a court-martial at our base of a crew that bombed Switzerland by mistake, and it was a pretty serious affair.
There are some people who call Bob Cedarburg's Jimmy Stewart, just so you know that. How about the transition when you came back? How was the transition from military to civilian life? Was it difficult? Was it hard? Did any of you take advantage of the GI Bill? Yeah, Jack,
Yeah,
go
I
ahead.
did. I went to Kent State University for 4 years, 3.5 actually.
With the GI Bill. Yeah, that was one of the greatest things that that was really done in terms of helping guys and also helping the country.
Well, go ahead.
It was a little hard for me. Well, the decision almost was made. My father and family kept our jewelry store going all those years while my brother John and I were in service, and there were only 2 jewelry stores in the county, and they just worked themselves almost to death. My dad, I came home and I was discharged in November, and my dad went upstairs. We lived above the store at Christmas Eve, and he never came down again. He was sick. I think he could have recovered, but he was so worn out from keeping a business going during those years. But there was help was not available, and the home front did a lot of work too.
I want to say one thing. When I first came back, I realized how much the civilian population helped us. They're the ones that made us successful. You know, when I see women, you know, how many women worked in them days? And they were in the factories.
Rosie the Riveter.
And I want to remember the farmers who gave us that good spam. And the women that worked in the factories and made those nice warm coats that we could wear on cold nights and so forth. So I can appreciate, and I know the men of the service seem to get all the honor at this time, and we forget that it wasn't for those people back home, we wouldn't have been as successful as we were. So I praise the Lord for them.
The Victory Gardens, Vivian, I'm sure, you know, in Cedarburg there were Victory Gardens, and and the scrap metal drives. I can remember, you know, when recycling first became a big thing a few years ago. I could remember when I was a little kid, we always stamped the cans and he collected the cans, and then any kettles or any scrap metal, you never threw that out. There will always be downtown during the war. There was a place, and that was collected, and the savings bonds and. You know, I remember when we were kids in school, we spent 25 cents a week. You could buy a stamp, and then when that book was full, you got a savings bond, and all the bond drives, and just really unbelievable. You know how much, Charlie? I think it's right. The home front really, you know, and the spam. I can, I can. In fact, one of the things that's on the table over there is I do have a diary from a fellow who lived in Thiensville, Leroy Bublitz, and the diary, it's his personal diary from landing, and it's really accurate from February 1945 until May of 1945. And I really sat down and read the thing the other day, and one of the things, one time he said, I'm going to miss dinner tonight because it's spam, and I just kind of hate that. But so yeah, the home front did play a lot in terms of what was going on. Yeah, Bob, you going to say something?
Were you going to
Yeah,
have
go
a
ahead,
show
yeah.
that one of the
Bob,
items?
one of the things that Bob did also, some of you may be aware of it, Bob was over in Europe when the 50th anniversary of D-Day was celebrated. That's where Tom Brokaw wrote the book, The Greatest Generation. He went for the 40th anniversary, and then he also went for the 50th anniversary of D-Day. And Bob was there and participated in that as well. I was going before you do that, Bob, let me ask, have any of the rest of you gone back to where you were or places you were during the war? I know there's some bad memories that you maybe wouldn't want to do that, but Bob, you've gone?
I got back to a couple of the bases I was stationed at in England. I didn't get to the one in Ireland, but I did get to two, one near London, which was really neat, although when I was there on this return trip, it was being used by the local police for training police dogs, and that was about the extent of it. And then later on, we got to the other base up on the East Coast, and the control tower that was still there, but the windows were all out. The hangars had been rented to somebody in the farm machinery business. They were loaded with farm machinery, and that was it.
I go back to England every 4 years for a reunion at our base. The base is still existing. It's a municipal airport now for a city of about 300,000 people, and all the buildings are there, the hangars, the tower is still there. The English don't destroy things. A university, it was a British base before the war, so we had brick buildings. We had a pretty, it was always called the country club. We had brick buildings and hot water. And so, but it's right at the city limits of this. So and we have a memorial. We left a memorial there. In addition to the library, we have £1 million set aside to keep this library going. We have American books, and we have 2 American librarians there full-time. If the British want any information about the United States, they just go there, and the librarians go out speaking to people. So it's the people are very happy about it. The British people run the library, but they appreciate that, and so when we go over there, we have a great time.
Well, Bob, go ahead.
Well, my wife wants me to tell a story, and I listen to my wife. 54 years, what the heck. Anyway, the last base I was at it in Italy when our pilots did long-range escort work with the P-51s, and we'd have a lot of time. I'd get out there at 3 o'clock in the morning, check the radios before they left on their mission. They were long missions. And then I had gotten acquainted with the British ACAC crew there, and I'd go over and have tea with them. And one day, it was almost a major catastrophe. They were out of tea. Now, for the British people to be out of tea, that was a major disaster. Well, we still had some tea that we'd brought down from England with us. We were on British rations when we were in Ireland and England. Some of them were pretty sad. But anyway, I went to our cook, Danny Gallagher. He was from up near Manitowoc. And I said, Danny, we have any of that tea left? The British are out of it. He said, sure. Gave me a whole bunch of it. And I took it over there, and they were so appreciative to get that tea. They were getting beer rations, which we hadn't gotten for a long time. And they gave me a couple of bottles of beer, one for Danny and one for me. And when I gave it to Danny, I said, do we have any? We were starting to get butter. About once a week, we were starting to get real butter, and not that stuff that stuck to the roof of your mouth. Anyway, they used to advertise it wouldn't melt at 110 degrees. But anyway, we were getting real butter. And so I walked into the tent that evening, the British tent, and I said, here's something from Danny Gallagher, our cook. It went dead quiet. And finally, one fellow, he'd been in the war for 5 years. He said, "Gor blimey." That was a British expression, you remember? He said, that's the first butter I've seen in 5 years. We didn't know what the war was back here.
Yeah, the British really, when you think in terms of Winston Churchill and, you know, as far as what the British did and some of the great speeches that Winston Churchill gave, never, you know, have so many given so much for so few given so much for so many, and, you know, all that they had to owe and the, what they went through. You know, one of the things that I remember too, Vivian, and I'm sure this happened in Cedarburg, we had blackouts. We had the civil defense where you had to have the blackouts where they would go around so that that if there ever was a air raid here that they couldn't see where the lights were and that type of thing. And you know, yeah, Jack.
How many people here realize that our west coast was bombed by the Japanese? Anybody? Yeah. They used that jet stream, which we didn't know about. And somehow or other they put barrage balloons up with bombs in them, and they landed out in is it Oregon or Washington in the mountains out there, and 8 or 10 of them.
Hoping for
Pardon?
They actually came as far east as Michigan.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I never heard that before.
Bloomfield, Michigan.
Is that right? I never heard that one. But yeah, they used that jet stream, I guess. But when you stop and think about it, that's quite a feat. How they did that. I never read how they did it, but they did it.
How about V-mail? Remember V-mail?
Late. Always late.
When you got the V-mail in service, when we would get V-mail here, it was always like it was microfilmed, you know, and it was just a small envelope. Is that the way that you got it in service, or was that done both ways, or was it just done one way?
You wrote it on a big sheet, but then they reduced it, and we got it, it was about that big. I've still got a couple of them.
Yeah, there's a couple of email on the one table over there. I was able to find some, and then I have Leroy Bublitz's scrapbook, too, from World War II, not just his diary, and there were some V-mail, empty V-mail things. That's why I asked the question, because I remember getting them. My brothers in service, you know, were my heroes, and they sent letters home to their little brother, and every so often there'd be something that would be blacked out that they would possibly give a location or whatever it might be. Yeah.
I didn't send no V-mail.
Use your mic, Charlie.
I didn't send any V-mail, but I sent a lot of holy mail. You know, they would read through your letters over there, and my sister had a few letters left when I got home, and you could just about make out what I said. They cut it out. There was more cut out than it was there was in there, so I call that holy mail.
I was a censor when I was in Iceland while our plane was being repaired. They didn't want this air crew idle, so they had a censor mail. The officers had a censor mail. We had a big table with black ink and the scissors, and we'd have to read all the letters and black out everything that the people back home shouldn't be hearing. So
I just read a book about the Second World War that a guy from Indiana wrote, and he had worked out with his brother that the first words, or the first letters of the first words in the first sentence that he wrote were a code to tell him where he was located. And he said he had to be very ingenious sometimes of putting those sentences together for fear of what might happen as far as the censors were concerned. But he said it was unbelievable that it worked all the time, and so that his family knew always where he was located in the war. I can remember that too, as far as pictures and stuff. I don't know how many times my mother thought that one of my brothers was in a picture, because if it was D-Day or if it was Battle of the Bulge or whatever it was, you know, or going across the Rhine or whatever, that you know, that, and the pictures and how people kept up on that. And if you look at the newspapers, the amount of material that was in the newspapers. I'd like to ask you all, with the new I guess resurgence, we can say, or understanding maybe of the fact that the people who served in the Second World War, a number of them are passing away, and a new resurgence of interest in World War II. Have you found that when people found that you were a participant in World War II, that they ask you maybe more about it than what they did previously? And one of the things, as Tom Brokaw says, or there's another great book out, Duty, by Tom Green, about the Second World War, and both of those hit on the idea that you know, Charlie, you said the people at home were heroes, but what the people in the Second World War went through, and it's hard for you to recall a lot of that. I know that, but you were the people who made the world safe for democracy, so to speak, as Franklin Roosevelt said, and I just wonder if you found that, if more people have found out you were in the Second World War, that you find more lately people asking you about that than maybe you did earlier. Can you respond to that?
I find that there is a lot of interest. Just this last year, I had a college student had to write a part of his grade was graded on an interview with me about World War II, and I've had two high school students interview me about World War II, and I did give a talk at St. Francis School. There's only 2.5 pages in the textbook, I guess, on World War II, and the teacher asked if anybody was willing to, had somebody in the family willing to talk about it.
It seems like when it comes to their attention, like referring to my diary, the write-up Bill Jantz made, he got over 100 emails. At the end of his column, he had his email address. I didn't have mine in there, so I didn't, but he gave me copies of the letters, and they were really warming. And then I received from, 35 people that called me directly, looked my number up in the phone book, I guess, and called. And then I had letters also. And not only that, that was on the web, by the way. Bill Jantz put that on the web, and we got letters from Oklahoma and all over the country. So they are interested when they see something.
You know, that going back again to, I don't want to plug Tom Brokaw too much, but his first book, The Greatest Generation, and this is what happened with him. So that he wrote the second book, The Greatest Generation Speaks, which is a compilation of letters that he received from people who were mentioned in the book, or they knew people who were mentioned in the book. And again, that's a most interesting type of thing to read in terms of if you're interested in the Second World War. Well, our time is fleeting, and we do have a closing ceremony involving our American Legion, the Peter Wallner Post 288 with Roger Butt, and we thought it would be appropriate. Yeah, Dorothy.
This is a book that my granddaughter has had publication on. In fact, she was going to be here today, but she is at a book signing, and that is strictly about World War II vets and their stories. We went to the first signing in Madison, and it was tremendous because so many of these men were still there.
Well, that's great.
She is doing a second book, and she hopes for publication Memorial Day area. Yes, and she does want to do one on women in service, I understand.
Great. This is The Hero Next Door, Stories from Wisconsin's World War II Veterans. That's great. And Lou, if you can let us know where, you know, should be, is it all in regular bookstores? And
yes.
Okay. And you know, there is a great Veterans Museum in Madison also, right on the square in Madison, and there's a number of museums, the D-Day Museum down in New Orleans now that Stephen Ambrose, historian Stephen Ambrose, established. Yeah, Dorothy?
What's the name of the bookstore? Schwartz Bookstore carries it. Yes.
Schwartz Bookstore. There's a Schwartz Bookstore in Mequon on Port Road, too. The author's name is Kristen Gilpatrick. Kristen Gilpatrick, The Hero Next Door, Stories from Wisconsin's World War II Veterans. And you know, there is another book, Flags of Our Fathers, is that the name of it? That gentleman from Appleton wrote. His father was, Mr. Bradley from Anigo, was one of the people who put the flag up at Iwo Jima. So that's great. The resurgence in the learning something about the Second World War is super. And hopefully next year then we can do this on the same time about the about Korea and Vietnam. Also, there's a lot of displays here. I would call attention to one. Frank Buchholz is here, and there's a big display there. It's a piece of a Zero from one of the planes that flew over Pearl Harbor in the attack, and it's explanatory there, and Mr. Buchholz will be there afterwards to talk with you. So Dick, if you want to take over, please.
Thank you, Mayor. In honor of the living and the dead and the missing in action, I ask you all to stand while we play taps.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you again, everybody, for coming. And we will see you. Watch for the next one. It's on